And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and we got a great show for you this evening. Back again, Ian Williams, and we know Ian is our resident expert on the United Nations and on all things international, and he has just published a book. And I got a copy of it, and I'm in the process of reading it, and it's a great book. I'm going to make sure I can see it right. Yeah, there it is. Untold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and war. And what I love, and what everybody I've shown this book loves about it, is that it's a book about a dry subject that's filled with illustrations and little cartoons that help you understand these sort of complex ideas that are inherent in an organization of 193 members like the United Nations. So welcome, Ian, to Let Them Talk again.
Thanks
welcome
for letting
again.
me back.
Oh, great. Well, it's always an interesting conversation. And let's begin by telling me a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Well, if you may or may not remember, for the 50th anniversary of the UN, we did the UN for Beginners, myself and this cartoonist.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same aim, basically, that we wanted to...
That's like Marx for Beginners.
it was actually part of that series.
Right.
I went to them because I thought, this is perfect. How do you make the UN interesting? And it's very difficult because, you know, the UN... There's either people who piously think it's the most wonderful organization in the world, and then they've all gone quiet now. But I remember a few years ago when we spoke, there were people who actually thought the UN had a fleet of black helicopters with peacekeepers about to take over the United States.
Yes.
I mean, you know...
It's actually Bolton, right?
Well, John Bolton never believed
Bolton.
in the black helicopters. For a start, he would make sure the UN didn't have enough money to buy black helicopters.
They would never get that far.
But I mean, no, I remember I went to one TV show just afterwards, and it was American Mothers Against the UN Land Grab. And it's very topical because it was about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And these people, American mothers, AstroTurf, were campaigning against the UN heritage sites because I think Yellowstone Park had just become an international heritage site.
Right.
What we were looked into was that when the president signs to make a site a World Heritage Site, the executive order sort of carries international law over, and it means that the US has got to stop, say, mining within 20 miles of the park and the National Heritage
It has to
Site.
have international
They
rules.
can't allow people to open a cement factory in the middle of the ancient temple or whatever.
So the cement factory people really go out there and they get...
And it was the mining companies who set up American Mothers Against the UN Land Grab to preserve their inalienable right to strip mine right up to the boundary of the park and further, given half a chance. You know, it's like a lot of these territorial struggles in the West.
Right, that's what they're really about.
I mean, that really sort of summed up... Because at the time, there were enough deranged people out there who all you had to do was to shout about the UN and they would start sending checks to you.
Yes.
Now they do it for Trump. I mean, they've shifted the main focus of their lunacy.
Right. And, well, there's a method to the madness. In part, the U.S.'s total mismanagement and disastrous intervention in Vietnam, followed by things like Watergate, undermined people's faith in the government, but unfortunately there was never really anything to take its place. Socialism had been discredited in the 50s as a bunch of spies taking our nuclear secrets and behind the scenes controlling the UN, which is totally ridiculous. And so they're open now to this like idea, the fake news propaganda. In some ways, it's very similar to 1930s Germany. I mean, you know, when Hitler got his hands on a radio microphone, that's when the terror really began. You know?
Well, with the UN, it was one of the things is that it really sums up the whole idea of the US as the city on the hill that's uniquely virtuous, because when the US was continually getting defeated by 190 votes to 1 or 2, because it's Israel almost every time.
Sure.
As far as they were concerned, the rest of the world was marching to the wrong drummer. You know,
right. They're the ones
we
who
were in step, everyone else was out of step.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So let's begin with that, because it wasn't always like that. I mean, when the United Nations started, the Soviet Union walked out because they couldn't win a vote, and communist China, Red China at the time, was not even allowed in, and this little island...
That was why the Soviet Union moved out.
Right.
Because they said, unless you allow Beijing, or Peking as it was in those days, to take the Chinese seat. We're going to walk out in protest. And then while they walked out, the Korean War started.
How come they didn't see that? I mean, I don't think that...
Well, they were starting the Korean War, so they should have known.
Right. Well, what was their mistake? What did they think was happening?
Planning. They weren't.
One hand didn't know what the other hand was doing.
It was a Trumpian foreign policy. It wasn't joined up.
Right. Right. They
It was
didn't
a
know what they were
series of
doing.
spasmodic reflexes.
Well, the U.S. really saw the opportunity and stepped right in. And as you say today, at the border where the two North and South Korean nations, which are still technically at war, meet, the flag that is over that building is, in fact...
It's the UN flag.
So the UN flag actually flies over...
Yeah, and the U.S. commander there is technically head of the UN forces in Korea. And
so the United Nations is still at war with North Korea.
Yeah, even though North Korea is a member. This is why you need cartoons, because
right. That's exactly. Those are the type of paradoxes that American conservatives especially hate, because they can't explain it. They can't get their heads around something that's that complex.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of horse trading going on where you let the North in, we let the South in, and that happened in Vietnam, happened in Germany, East and West Germany.
Right. How did the UN deal with Vietnam back in the 50s?
Badly. UNtold protested about it, and said it was terrible the way the war was being conducted, and but it didn't become a major. It didn't come to the Security Council because both sides would have probably vetoed it. Mm-hmm. If the US had produced a resolution saying North Vietnam is infiltrating troops into the south, which it surely was,
right.
then the Russians would have vetoed it. The other way around, if the Russians produced resolutions saying that they're bombing the north and they're bombing Cambodia, which we were. But notice there was this little sort of punctiliousness about international law. They pretended that they weren't bombing Cambodia, and they pretended that they weren't bombing Laos. So they were dropping World War II loads of bombs on countries in secret. Yeah. You'd thought somebody might have noticed these bangs. Talk about mainstream media.
Right, so in a way, Trump isn't so different from everything that's happened before. If any, he's less, because he's not actually bombing anybody that we know about.
Now if they drop bombs on Laos, there'll be millions of Laotians with their iPhones taking pictures of them as they came down.
Right. No more secrets.
It's a bit difficult to hide.
No more secrets.
North Korea, they managed.
So the UN started out, and then the United States faced with what happened that the UN began to switch in a way that the votes would go from pro-America, pro-United States in the 50s to this 1960s era when all the votes started going against the United States?
Well, there's a couple of things happened. The first was, it was genuine. Everyone sort of believed in it with varying degrees of cynicism. And the price for getting Russia and America, and to some extent Britain, on board was the veto, which they had. Mm-hmm. So any one of the five great powers can veto any resolution against it. And, frankly, everyone says this is terrible and unprincipled, but in the end, it's very difficult to enforce UN resolutions against a nuclear power, which is why people are so eager to get nuclear weapons.
To get them, right? It gives you that power.
We're going to attack Russia. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. We're only kidding.
Why Timor-Leste wants an international criminal court representative, so possibly people who invade their country and murder their citizens can be held accountable.
Well, you're coming to a key point. The first big tranche was the decolonization, which was a UN project, by the way. They systematically overlooked decolonization because it wasn't a big issue with the United Nations. The League of Nations was actually better organized with the mandates and the other stuff.
That was the original. What was the League of Nations?
League of Nations was set up after the First World War, and it was under Woodrow Wilson's principles of self-determination for everyone except Kurds, Turks,
or whoever
Germans,
who were written out of the boundaries at the time. Because they rewrote the boundaries after the First World War for a lot of countries.
In Europe, they did it quite seriously. They went and they chased the ethnic boundaries. If you accept the crazy idea of the sovereign nation state, then the League of Nations did well. They had plebiscites and they had commissioners.
Why did the United States, despite the fact that it was Woodrow Wilson, our president's idea, fail to join the League of Nations? And why?
I've heard two different reasons. One was that they really didn't like all these foreigners and they didn't want to get in another war. But one I heard, and I haven't had a chance to check this one out, is that the Treaty of Versailles was a bit like the famous Treaty of Westphalia. Everyone and his dog was mixed in was thrown into the mix.
I see.
You know, you look after Fido twice a week, and I look after it once a week. In this particular case, what I'd heard was that the French had insisted that as part of the overall treaty, champagne be protected.
Oh, okay.
As
so
an
there's a lot of
appellation
trade,
controlé.
right. So there's a lot of trade things.
California wasn't having that, and no one else was having it.
Oh, I see.
And this was just as prohibition was coming up, but this is one story that.
Right, but that would say that there was a lot of things written into there, and a lot of things that might have been seen as like interfering with trade or things like that. At the time,
and also, I mean, Woodrow Wilson actually annoyed a lot of people, and the way he did things, and a lot of people think that if he'd been a little more of an astute politician instead of an elitist, racist patrician,
right. That's what he was, right?
He might have, he might have won it over. Not necessarily on those grounds. I don't think the people who voted against the League of Nations, I don't think were worried about him being a racist. Some of them might have had sort of redneck inhibitions about him being a patrician,
right?
But
so that's really the root of American isolationism: is that international agreements might affect, especially in the mid 20th century, affected our ability to trade freely in different products.
Well, I mean, one of the major things that Roosevelt did throughout the Second World War was to attempt to split up the British Empire because they wanted to be able to trade with the British colonies. So all the way through the war, he was patting.
Right.
He was patting Churchill on the back with one hand, and in the other he was sticking a knife in.
Right. And there was almost conflict.
Yes.
U.S. and England almost had a few conflictual moments in Italy and different places.
Very serious, yes. Yeah. I mean, there was... no, it never came close to blows, but I mean, it was a point of total dependency. But when the United Nations came, everyone believed in it. It was all... one of the interesting consequences is because the British were in the League of Nations adopted British English. So the English at the UN is British English.
I see. Oh, what is the main language at the UN? I thought it was French. No, it's English.
French. Yeah, it's even at my time there, the French has sort of almost disappeared.
Right.
Yeah, and it used to be the two working languages were English and French, which is still partially true in Geneva, but even there.
So decolonization is pretty much what, once these colonies became independent, and the whole idea, you have Patrice Lumumba and all these people talking about it, and even in America, Malcolm X and different people talking about these things.
They all got votes, and they all tended to vote, the non-aligned bloc tended to be anti-American and anti-colonialist and Didn't always work that way. I remember speaking to one diplomat, and he said, when the French colonies got independence, we all thought this is wonderful. There were 30 French colonies in Africa. He said, and then when we went into the General Assembly, and there was one French guy sitting in the corner, he twerked an eyebrow, and 30 French colonies' arms all went up.
Right. They'd all vote for the French position.
Regardless,
Right.
It was just...
Those days ended, basically.
Well, this is what they invented neocolonialism, and they did it so well. I mean, they did care.
What is neocolonialism? Just describe it for the audience.
Well, neocolonialism is that basically the overtly colonial relationships were switched for... You didn't have a French governor. You had a French advisor who sat in the president's office and told him what to do, or else.
Right. And the U.S. was like the best at that in a way. I mean, they're IMF and World Bank.
Yeah, they weren't as subtle.
Okay.
But they tried. So anyway, that gave a majority for the non-aligned, and then this really began to upset the Americans because up till then they'd won all the votes. The U.S. didn't use a veto till way into the 60s.
So it never used a veto for the first 20 years, basically.
Yeah, it didn't have to. It won the votes anyway.
Yeah.
And the Russians, of course, had a minority, so they kept using the veto.
Right.
On all sorts of things.
Right. And now it's the opposite way, right?
Yeah, now it's the other way because the Americans... They used the veto on behalf of Israel almost invariably, but the early vetoes, in fact, were in support of South African racist Rhodesia. We should remember this.
Right, to protect it.
Yes.
Right.
They were vetoing sanctions against South Africa and Rhodesia.
Who was?
The British and the Americans.
Both vetoed those sanctions,
yes.
right? I didn't know that specifically, but I assume so because I remember in college being so involved in the divestment movement, and it was today everybody runs around. Obama was president, and where everybody's just outraged by Trump and his Nazi friends and all of that. But back in the 1980s, when I was in college, racism was de jour.
Hey,
you were like some sort of a troublemaker.
The United Nations did raise the question of segregation in the U.S. quite often. And in fact, the first greatest American in there, Ralph Bunche, who's got a memorial opposite the UN, he was the first African-American diplomat, and he was given the choice between being an Undersecretary General in New York with the United Nations or being sort of Deputy Secretary of State in the US. And as he told his wife, he said, well, in Washington, I'd have to ride at the back of the bus. In New York, I can go into restaurants without being lynched, you know.
Right.
So he chose the UN.
Situation. He chose the UN.
And
he was freer to live in New York.
And he was up in front of the Un-American Activities Committee.
Sure. Oh, yeah. If you were in the 1950s or 60s.
Working for the UN, being black, and I mean,
civil rights was subversive.
Yeah.
It was. And it's hard. And in a way, Trump and his people are trying to go back to when he says make America great, when it was subversive to be to put your knee on, to not stand for the American flag, get you in a lot of trouble, more trouble than today. So great. So we're at the point now where anti-colonialism comes, these countries become independent, the vote starts going against the United States. But in all this chaos, with all these vetoes and all this tension at the top level, how is it that the United Nations gets anything done, and does it get anything done?
Well, it gets a lot done because there's a lot of stuff to agree on. I mean, until somebody comes and throws, fireworks in the ring, like Trump did almost with his speech. Even his speech was actually extremely statesmanlike by the standards that he could have come out with.
The UN speech was frightening.
It could have been much more frightening.
Well, how does that play? Let's talk about Trump for a minute. How does, Trump's tearing up of all the social norms, whether they were hypocritical or not, they were superficial norms that were followed by all these nations for decades, and he just walks in there and says...
Well, he didn't. No, he was, in his own way, he was doing a lot of stroking, and for the good or bad of it, I counted. He mentioned sovereignty 21 times in his speech.
Right.
I'm afraid, do you hear the crowds out there shouting sovereignty?
No.
They wouldn't know. I mean, they wouldn't know what sovereignty was. They probably think it's some type of
there's sovereignty
token for the Las Vegas.
But there's a sovereignty movement in the United States that's against the UN.
Yeah, but I mean, it's there, but it's esoteric, and that was also partially attached. It was interesting. He was playing to the gallery at the UN because the countries that applauded him, it was like the index page on the Amnesty International Human Rights Report.
Really?
All of the rogues, they all believe in sovereignty. The Serbs believe in their sovereign right to kill Kosovars and Bosnians. The Chinese believe in their sovereign right to do down Tibetans, and the Indians think that they can kick the Kashmiris around.
Isn't it isolationism is practiced by the United States and supported by Trump, that sort of nationalistic view, which McCain basically called out as Nazism yesterday? Yeah. Isn't that, in a sense, I think you write it in your book, your freedom to kill whoever you feel like.
Your own people, yes.
Your own people or whoever,
It ain't nobody's business what I do,
Right.
And I mean...
And that's where the sovereign movement in the United States, opposed to the UN, came from. It's mostly unreconstructed Confederate types and stuff.
I mean, it was the sound of silence in that speech because he missed out what he missed out was what the UN has developed over the years has been a whole collective global response, We believe in a global response to climate change. Mm-hmm. We think there's global action against nuclear weapons. The rest of the world signed a treaty banning nuclear weapons.
Right.
There are bans on nuclear tests.
So nothing is national nowadays. If the United States is putting global greenhouse gases in the environment, it affects the climate halfway around the world, everywhere around the world as well. So therefore, it's not a national problem of the United States.
Yeah, well, if Mexico opens a uranium smelter on the fence, technically it ain't nobody's business,
Exactly. So, but it would be there, and you would find the states of California and Texas probably screaming bloody murder. Yeah, but they have their own on the other side of the border that they're not telling you about.
And this part of the
how does the UN deal with that kind of selfishness, that global international capitalist?
It's horse trading. The classic, the classic one is the International Treaty on the Law of the Sea, which was sort of 40 or 50 years in the writing.
Yeah.
I mean, this was, Bismarck said that if you like eating sausages, you shouldn't watch them being made, and it's the same with treaties.
Right.
And this was a masterpiece. Everybody was trading. Everybody was pandering to the US. And now we have the position where the Pentagon, the State Department, and the U.S. military in general want the U.S. to sign the International Treaty on the Law of the Sea.
Right.
Because it's based on reciprocal agreements. And unless you sign on, you don't get the protections.
So you get rights and protections.
Yeah. And so for example, under the Arctic Ocean, the Russians who've signed the international treaty, they're laying claim almost almost up the creeks in Alaska now, because they can do.
Well,
because
what's Bolton and Trump and that whole crowd doing? The neocons. I don't know who's running the country now, but what do they say about these things like the international?
It's symbolic because they cannot accept the idea that there's anything between God and the U.S. Congress.
Right, but what happens if we're losing because of that? We're losing investment opportunities for the capitalist pigs of America.
We're talking to people who are prepared to destroy a health service and put 40 million people.
The same one who voted for him.
The
first thing
it's
not going to affect us in New York. You still go to Bellevue if you have no money, and they'll treat you for everything you got with the highest technology imaginable. But there won't be any rural health service anymore. You'll have to go 400 miles to the nearest hospital.
And they'll say, I told you that Obamacare was no good. You can hear them.
Right. Well, race is a powerful force in America, and people don't want to.
The whole thing is that's the secret. You have to remember. I mean, we're straying off the UN, but
it's related. It seems
the secret of the New Deal was the people to make it acceptable to the Southern whites. Essentially, black people were excluded from it, from the housing provisions.
Right.
Field workers, domestic workers, almost anybody. Yes. All the people Fred Trump excluded were excluded from
Long
the
Island
New Deal.
housing projects and stuff. Yeah.
And this was the deal that FDR used to get the New Deal through. But it was based on that deep residual, not even residual, rampant racism.
So all those brown people who are on the UN and are represented by the UN aren't going to put up with that. They're going to they might have international rules and regulations that mean that the United States is going to have to get used to treating people who are not white.
They defer equally to the US far more than they should. I mean, they don't call it out nearly as brutally as they should do. Sometimes they get exasperated.
Why don't they do that? What are they afraid of? Is the US paying their fair share anymore?
Do you remember the voting on Iraq? It all comes together. When Yemen voted against the first invasion of Iraq, the U.S. ambassador turned around and told them that's the most expensive vote you'll ever cast.
I remember that. Right.
And they pulled all of the aid. They pulled trade treaties. Saudi Arabia threw out every Yemeni guest worker, which was almost everybody.
Yeah.
I don't know who swept the streets in there.
They all came to New York. They live up in the Bronx, opening up stores, taking over bodies in the Bronx.
But that was at the beginning of the Yemeni sort of downfall, economically speaking, and it was a straightforward payback on the vote.
Right. Okay. So the U.S. has a lot of
as
power
well at the time.
But people come from all over the world, as you mentioned in your book, which is we're talking about your book here, which is a fascinating book, as you tell from this conversation. We're just touching on a little bit. If you want to really understand the UN, this is really a beautiful guide, and it's filled with all kinds of great illustrations. It's illustrated to help make it interesting and easier to read to people who might not have a degree in foreign policy or something like that.
And we've got to mention the cartoonist Krishna. Who's an old friend of mine. We've worked together on many things, and he actually works for the UN, and so he doesn't have a sort of he doesn't. The pigeon here doesn't have a halo.
Now, what about what about parking? I mean, should the UN be forced out of New York because they take up all our parking?
It's diplomatic parking. It's the
Ed Koch, which mayor hated the UN the most?
I don't know. It was Ed Koch.
Ed Koch hated the UN.
And who was the one before?
Mayor Beam.
Mayor Beam, I think, said that they should take the UN out to sea. But I mean,
Trump was that because they were pro-Israeli, they were Zionists, and they were voting in favor of the Palestinians over and over again. These poor people, stateless people.
Yeah, that's
and who the UN basically provides a passport to and provides some sort of help.
It provides all of their help.
Well, they hate that because
Israel. I mean, this is you get these crazy bits. There are congressmen in Washington who think they're supporting Israel by lobbying to cut funding to UNRWA, the agency that pays for the Palestinians' rations and education. The Israelis don't want them to. Under international law, that makes them responsible.
Okay. They're
supposed to pay for the refugees they created under the Geneva Conventions.
I see. Right. If you create refugees,
the last thing the Israeli government, of course they want to get as much.
So who's creating the refugees in Syria?
Well,
and is the UN doing? What's the UN doing for the Syrian refugees? How come they're not doing more? How come the Syrians keep coming over?
They have been.
We have this refugee crisis.
The UN is the major lifeline in humanitarian terms. What the UN has totally failed on is because of the great powers. They've totally failed. They have the instruments under what Kofi Annan got through, which was the responsibility to protect. They could have intervened at some point in there. The problem now is that I don't think anybody can think
Why didn't
Even
they
if
want to
people
intervene? Why didn't the UN want to intervene, get involved in Syria?
Whatever they did was wrong. It's like Kurdistan now.
Right. And what's happening with Kurdistan? Well, I just had an interview for my other show about Kurdistan from somebody in Erbil, Scott Taylor, who's telling me that they can't believe at the last minute the Kurdish military pulled out after their independence vote. It
looks like a deal. Somebody cooked up a deal. I mean, this is Levantine politics in the original.
Okay.
I mean, I don't believe the Iraqi army fought, though. The Iraqi army ran away when ISIS came.
Yes, right. Where's right. So they're not afraid of the Iraqi army, right? They made a deal somewhere. They're calling it a sellout. Done a deal. People are saying it was a sellout. The Kurdish people are saying, yeah.
But I suspect the Kurds,
the Barzani family, or
they've done a deal, and part of the deal would have been the US putting very, very heavy pressure on the Kurds. Because of the repercussions with Turkey and everything else.
Right, to be independent. Yeah. Will they ever do anything for the Kurds, UN?
Well, Kurdistan was supposed to be under the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson. They were at Versailles and they were promised their own country.
Right.
That was over 70, 80 years ago.
We're still waiting, right?
They're still waiting. So.
Right.
Good luck with the UN, chaps.
Right. Will the UN be able to prevent, and we only have 2 minutes left, will the UN be able to prevent a war between the US and Iran? Will it be able to prevent a war between the US and North Korea? Will it be able to end nuclear weapons in our time?
It will provide the weapon. One of the things I say is when you have idiots climb up a tree, the UN provides the ladder for them to climb down gracefully. And in this case, it's the US is refusing to negotiate with North Korea, refusing to negotiate with Iran, refused to negotiate with lots of people, including the Russians over the years. But the UN gave them a way to get round that, and for intermediaries and for people to be in a similar room. But, this sort of mark of Cain. Remember, Andrew Young was banned and sacked as UN ambassador for having a private conversation with the Palestinian ambassador.
Right, so they're blocking any attempt to have peace, but there is something happening behind the scenes right now. We have half a minute. What about the nuclear weapons charter? That seems to be the best thing the UN's done in a long time.
Nobel Peace Prize winner this time has just come, but I mean, it's a pragmatic treaty, and it only applies if the nuclear powers sign it, and none of them have so far.
Every other country but them. So the UN is in the lead. The poor countries, the former colonial countries, are in the lead.
Yeah, well, it's not just them, remember. We're talking about the nice people, the Canadians and the Dutch and the Swedes.
Good for them.
The civilized people, the ones with health services and things like that.
Thank you. To read more about this and continue the conversation, this is the book. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Ian, for joining us again.
As always, good.